At Pompeii, the famous Roman town in southern Italy, the remains of which were left largely intact after being buried under volcanic ash from Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, there is a mosaic featuring a famous battle. This lies in a villa known as the House of the Faun and depicts Alexander III, king of Macedon, charging into battle against the Persian Emperor Darius III. The mosaic is a vast piece which would have dominated the room within the Roman villa. And this begs the question, why were the Romans who lived here so interested in this Greek ruler who had lived 400 years earlier that their home was decorated with a huge mosaic of him? The answer is that Alexander III, better known as Alexander the Great, was famed as the most significant general the ancient world had ever seen. This is the story of Alexander the Great and his conquests. Alexander of Macedon was born in the summer of 356 BC in Pella, the capital of the Kingdom of Macedon at the time. This was the late classical period of ancient Greek history, a period which began roughly around 700 BC. During the classical period, the Greek world, which extended across much of the eastern Mediterranean, was dominated by hundreds of city-states or polis. They were usually quite small, being little more than an individual city or town, with the adjoining countryside to supply it with food. Some of these polis were monarchies, such as Macedon itself, while others were democracies, such as the city-states of Athens and Thebes. Others still were mixed government, such as Sparta, a warrior state which combined elements of a monarchy and an oligarchy. Various powers had become ascendant at different times in the 6th and 5th centuries BC, such as the Athenians and Spartans. But none of these Greek polis had managed to unite the Greek world under the leadership of one ruler. Alexander would change all of that. At the time that he was born in 356 BC, Alexander's father was already beginning to grow the power of the Kingdom of Macedon. Philip II was a strong king, one who had began conquering parts of northern Greece in the 350s, then Thrace in the 340s, before heading south towards the preeminent power of southern Greece in the early 330s BC, the city-state of Thebes. In 338 BC, he succeeded in winning a great victory over an alliance of the smaller Greek city-states at the Battle of Chaeronea near Thebes. This brought most of mainland Greece north as far as what is now Macedonia and Bulgaria under the rule of the Kingdom of Macedon. Thus, when Philip was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards in 336 BC, Alexander succeeded as a 20-year-old king to a dominion which was already preeminent in mainland Greece. Alexander spent the first years of his reign consolidating his own power and then expanding Macedon's presence within the Greek world even further, conquering regions north into what is now Serbia. He also crushed the resistance of the Greek city-states, which had revolted following Philip's death, and razed the city of Thebes to the ground as a message that he would not brook any further recalcitrance. However, Alexander's eyes were especially set on the east. Ever since the 6th century BC, a vast swathe of territory from Asia Minor in what is now Turkey, south and eastwards into Egypt, the Levant, and what was then known as Mesopotamia and Persia, but which we now know as Iraq and Iran, had been ruled by the Persian Empire. Its ruler had even attempted to conquer Greece itself in the early 5th century BC, but Athens and Sparta had led an alliance which staved off their incursions. Having united the Greek world under his rule, Alexander now believed he could undertake the conquest of the Persian Empire. And so, having gathered a great army together, he set off eastwards in 334 BC, just 2 years after ascending to the throne. Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor in 334 BC with an army of nearly 50,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. They would be heavily outnumbered by the Persians, but the Greek hoplite infantry, fighting in phalanx formations, were the elite warriors of their day, capable of defeating numerically superior armies on the field of battle through superior discipline, equipment, and tactics. Progress was gradual in the first months, with Alexander securing the coastline of Turkey and then moving inland. In the spring of 333 BC, he and his men crossed the river Taurus in southern Turkey. Proceeding eastwards, he captured more regions throughout the summer before eventually meeting the Persian Emperor Darius in the field of battle at Issus in early November 333 BC. It is this engagement which is depicted on the vast mosaic found at Pompeii. Here his Greek forces met an enemy who outnumbered them 2-1, but Alexander's outstanding generalship and personal leading of a charge through the Persian lines saw Darius's forces flee in disorder. By the time the dust settled, as many as 25,000 Persians had lost their lives, while Alexander had lost less than 1,000, albeit with several thousand more wounded. Victory at Issus opened the way for Alexander to proceed down the coastline of the Levant the following spring, capturing the city of Tyre in 332 BC after a long siege, and then advancing into Egypt. By early 331 BC, much of the western parts of the Persian Empire were in his hands. Even as he prepared to advance northeast towards Mesopotamia and Persia, where Darius was regrouping to defend his core territories, Alexander and his followers, generals like Ptolemy and Cassander, were appointing administrators to govern these new territories on their behalf, and even to begin building new cities, each of which was named Alexandria after their founder, the Great King. The ultimate showdown between Alexander and Darius eventually occurred on the 1st of October 331 BC at the Battle of Gaugamela in what is now northern Iraq. By this time, the Persian Emperor had been able to amass a new army of approximately 100,000 men, many of them cavalry. Arrayed against them were just over 45,000 Greek soldiers. But again, superior military tactics and Alexander's own generalship proved superior. Indeed, the emperor's fear of his Greek foe was evident in the weeks leading up to the battle, for he had offered Alexander large portions of his empire and his own daughter's hand in marriage if he would retreat home to Greece. Alexander had other ideas, and by the end of the day, the devastating phalanxes of the Greek hoplites had left nearly half of Darius's men dead on the field of battle. Darius himself escaped, but in the months that followed, as Alexander began seizing Persia itself, he was killed by his own brother, Bessus, who then submitted to Alexander. The war was won, and everything from Greece eastwards to Persia was under Alexander's control. Here the tale might have ended. Alexander could have appointed administrators to rule his empire and return to Greece, but he remained there, bringing Bactria in modern-day Afghanistan under his rule too. As he did, many worried about his adoption of Persian types of dress and court rituals. Perhaps Alexander was becoming too oriental. But if he was, it was because his ambitions were not yet fully fulfilled, for the Macedonian ruler had developed ambitions to conquer all of the known world. At this time, the Greeks knew this to extend into India and no further, and so in the mid-320s, he began preparing to invade the subcontinent and see how many more people there were to conquer there. Campaigns were undertaken here, and further ones were planned for the Arabian Peninsula, but the great conqueror had begun to overextend himself. While he campaigned into the Indus Valley, revolts began to break out amongst his subjects back in Greece and elsewhere. Thus it was that he delayed his ambitions to conquer the whole world temporarily and returned to Babylon in modern-day Iraq, a city which he was now planning to make the capital of his new empire. It was here in mid-June 323 BC that he died in mysterious circumstances. Some claimed he had been poisoned, but the most likely explanation is that Alexander had picked up some mysterious illness during his last campaign into northern India. Thus, the great man's desire to conquer regions where no Greek ruler had ever tread was ultimately his undoing. Alexander was just 32 years old when he died in the summer of 323 BC. He was probably childless at the time, though a son of his, also named Alexander, was born some weeks later to Princess Roxana of Bactria, whom Alexander had married just before initiating his campaign into India. Because there was no adult heir to succeed to his empire, nor would there be one for decades, Alexander's empire was divided following his death between his leading companions and generals who had followed and aided him throughout his campaigns. Greece and Macedon were ruled by Antigonus on behalf of Alexander's infant son. Egypt was seized by Ptolemy, while the major benefactor was Seleucus, one of Alexander's more minor generals, who nevertheless succeeded in wresting control of a vast tract of land, including nearly all of the Levant, Persia, and parts of Asia Minor, in what is now eastern Turkey. These powers, in particular Ptolemaic Egypt and the Seleucid Empire, would rule much of the world of the eastern Mediterranean until they were conquered themselves over 2 centuries later by the Romans. As a result of Alexander's immense conquests, he was revered throughout antiquity. Cities and countries from Greece eastwards through Asia Minor, Egypt, and the Levant continued to bear his names for centuries to come. Indeed, the city of Alexandria in the river Nile delta of Egypt grew to become the foremost city in the eastern Mediterranean and the intellectual and scientific center of the Roman Empire. All conquerors, from the Greek generals who followed Alexander in the 3rd century BC, through to Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus in Roman times, all compared themselves to Alexander, a figure who was lauded as having conquered the known world. As a result, images of him adorned mosaics in villas and temples throughout the world of late antiquity. As such, while he never lived to enjoy his conquests, Alexander's fame and legacy in ancient times was incomparable.